we're here to talk today about essential tools in planning for 2025. For anyone who's been around for more than a bit in the data protection market, there's an enormous amount of tools. There's a long list of tools that you could be using. Some of them overlap a bit or a lot, and we're here to try to put some order and make some sense out of the current landscape in data security, which tools can be used and which legacy tools can be enhanced with some of the newer modern tools. Let's move on to the next slide and let's get going. And we'll be going back and forth here with me, myself and Michael, and we'll be doing a few interesting demos just to get ourselves thinking about the different and interesting scenarios. But the first point I want to make is that when we think about the data security problem can be broken and sliced in many different ways, but the way I like to slice it is first initially looking at the type of data that we want to protect. And if you slice it into the two problems, which are structured data and unstructured data, that starts a much deeper discussion about the types of attacks that we're concerned about, which we'll talk about in a moment, versus the tools we have to mitigate the risks within every one of these different types of data, because they truly carry very, very different risks within them. So what we are going to focus this discussion on is specifically unstructured data. Now, when talking about unstructured data, I'd like to call out an important point. We've always been trained to think in the context of structured versus unstructured, and then when we talk about unstructured, let's talk about data at rest versus data in motion. And what I usually come across is this deep understanding that data at rest is something we need to protect. However, data at rest usually doesn't become a significant issue until it starts to move, right? So if you think about a bunch of files in your OneDrive or SharePoint, or any, in your Azure Blob or S3 bucket, if that data is stagnant and nobody's using it, nobody's reading or modifying it or sending it somewhere, then it's not really a problem. Yes, there are compliance checkboxes that we need to fill in, but when that data starts to move, that is where we really need to get concerned. And the problem we're going to talk about is the challenge of having visibility, gaining visibility, and enforcing controls on unstructured data when it moves. So an example would be, think about an applicant sending in a resume, and that applicant sending in that resume through maybe a third-party facing portal or through an HR tool. That resume definitely includes PII, private information that helps identify that specific individual. And while it is okay for the HR team to view that data, potentially in some states and some countries, some of that data should be contained within HR and should never be shared, obviously outside of the company, but even within the company, there should be limitations and restrictions on who is allowed to view every type of data. So if we think about the problem, think about an HR person receiving a resume, downloading it onto their endpoint, from there potentially sending it over email to the HR department, maybe sharing it over Teams with one of the hiring managers, uploading it into Box or into OneDrive or SharePoint for the resume repository. Suddenly you have a multitude of variants of this file. And these variants of this specific file that contains private data is suddenly everywhere, which means that the attack surface where that data can be exfiltrated from is much more significant and honestly much more complex to actually protect. So the question I'd like to pose here, and this is kind of the lens we're going to use to evaluate different tools that have been there and new modern capabilities that are arising in the past few years, we're going to look at it through the lens of how do we ensure that data doesn't move wherever it wants to or wherever user want that data to move, and how do we put controls on it so when it does move, it moves in a compliant way in a manner that doesn't allow easy data exfiltration. Let's move on to the next slide and let's start talking about the technology as a whole. I'd like to make a point about two significant risks that unstructured data. When I say unstructured data, what do I mean? I mean files, right? PDF files, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, design documents, image files. All of these documents as a whole, they can carry many different risks. But if you really want to look at the 80-20, or in this case, probably 95-5, the true majority, the vast majority of all files carry two main risks within them. The first one is the risk of private data, sensitive data. If that data exists within that document, we need to put controls on who has access to the document, where can that document be sent to, can it leave the organization or not, who can be exposed to it, and what is every user allowed to do with that document: read, modify, delete, etc. This specific problem is dealt by many tools. We'll talk about that in a moment. But a second type of problem is that that same file can carry malicious content within it. And when I say malicious content, what I really mean is malware, ransomware, zero-day attacks. So the known attacks that we have known signatures for, and the unknown attacks, the 0 days, the ones that come in flying through your antivirus and your sandbox. They don't detect them because they don't know what to detect, because it is not known to be bad at that point in time. And that file can carry that component or that object into your organization, which will then initiate an exfiltration type attack. So private data is one problem, malicious content is the other one. I'd like to start by talking about the tools that are used in order to mitigate these problems. So let's start with one on the left-hand side, endpoint detection and response. Very similarly to antivirus type protection, sandbox type protection, endpoint detection obviously sits on the endpoint as an endpoint agent, looks at different things happening within the endpoint and waits for something malicious to land and to initiate an action that would then be detected as suspicious or malicious. And once that happens, then endpoint detection comes into play by mitigating that, controlling the endpoint, potentially wiping it, flagging the admins that they need to go chase something that has happened on the endpoint. It's a detection-based tool that finds something that is already happening. Let's move on and talk for a moment about DLP. I'll move this back to you, Michael, when we talk about DLP, and then we'll fall back onto the SPM.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, DLP is a technology that's been around for quite a while. It is obviously used across many organizations. However, DLP tools, they have their limitations in the technology, right? So the first challenge with DLP, you have to define your policies, right? The masking, or not the masking, but the blocking, the detection, etc. And since businesses are constantly evolving and changing, this requires constant maintenance and updating of those policies and definitions and the patterns to keep up with the business needs. So this creates basically an elevated management overhead for your security and IT teams. The second challenge with DLP is that it can create workflow blockers for end users. When a DLP policy detects sensitive content in files, it really only has two options. It can either block the file completely, and this creates, slowdowns for your end users. They have to open support tickets. They have to get a hold of the security team. That security team then has to look at the information, verify that it's okay, and then they can release it, right? But the other option is they just simply let it through. It doesn't create any blockers, but then now you've created a potential data leakage part of your organization. So like I said, it has good uses, but it does have some challenges.
And I'll add, if we draw a parallel between DLP and endpoint EDR, endpoint detection and response, there are two similar, I'd say, challenges here. The first one is obviously the false positives, as Michael mentioned, right? There's a lot of a lot of things detected that are not really a problem. So we're flooded with all of these inputs and triggers that now require some manual intervention. So that's problem number one. But problem number two is think about what we're finding here. What we are finding with DLP and EDR are problems that already exist. So problems that we have not prevented in the first place. That's kind of a problem, right? If we're trying to tackle a problem where data is already being exfiltrated or where malware is already on the endpoint, that's kind of late in the game. So for that, one of the things that, in order to protect private data, many vendors came forward years ago and said, let's help you first discover the problem. Let's help you discover where data is. That initially took the form of data discovery and classification tools, some embedded within data security platforms. And these tools were really initially intended to find all of the private data, all of the sensitive data, classify it, and then later on, once we know what we have, put controls on it. It reached a limitation when data started moving from on-prem to the cloud, where data in the cloud, in SaaS applications, in cloud environments, became more difficult to track, and that brought the rise of the DSPM, the Data Security Posture Management tools. Data Security Posture Management, fantastic tools for scanning your cloud environments, right? You'd like to scan your Azure environment or your AWS environment or GCP, your SaaS applications, and you want to find everywhere where you have your crown jewels, your private data, your PCI, PII, PHI, credentials, you name it, sensitive data, IP, legal data. You want to find it in order to know where you might need to put in place more controls. So compared to endpoint detection and data loss prevention, DSPM and data discovery tools are more visibility tools, right? You scan an environment, it gives you a view, a nice view of where you are and where your data is. The side effect of that is obviously now you have a list of things you need to do. Now you have a list of challenges you need to deal with. So, hey, there's this duplicate database, you need to go and delete it. Or, hey, there's a folder in OneDrive, too many people have access to it, you need to reduce access on that folder, right? Or, hey, maybe this file that originated in this folder is now moving throughout these different folders. Is that okay, or is that a risk because of the type of data it contains? So DSPM tools give you a good understanding of where the data is in the cloud and who has access to the data and put some controls on it. However, if you take a step back and you think about what we're actually trying to achieve here, the business initiative is not a DLP tool or a DSPM tool or an endpoint detection tool. The end goal or the initiative we're going after is preventing data exfiltration, preventing insider risk, putting some controls on third-party risk, and a few other initiatives which we will deep dive into in a moment. But the idea is, how do we move beyond? And this is a question for you all out there, when you're now looking into which tools will solve these set of problems that you're trying that you've just identified a moment ago, right? Third-party risk, insider risk. How are you going to go about solving these problems instead of just buying a tool? So we'll look into that. I would say the main question becomes, how do we automate that process? How do we, instead of just buying visibility tools which tell us what the problem is and then we need to figure out a thousand things, how do we put in place automated tools that can fix the problem for us? And on this next slide, I'd like to introduce the notion and this new space within data protection, which is called DDR, which is short for data detection and response. Just quickly reminding everyone, the chat is open on the webinar chat. You can ask questions, make comments, and we'll be happy to answer. So data detection and response is a new realm within data protection that is intending to solve exactly that problem, which says we have our legacy tools, DLP, DSPM, endpoint detection, data discovery, data classification. It finds the problem, it mitigates it to some extent, but it creates a whole lot of noise. And to be honest, the mitigation that these tools put in place is really a binary allow or block, as Michael mentioned a moment ago. Either you allow the data through and you put the organization at risk, or you don't, and then the user cannot do their job. So how do you allow the data to flow through, but responsibly? So how do you allow granular controls on what data is allowed to flow through versus what is not allowed to flow through? And let's actually move on to the next slide and talk about the first problem, which we'd like to address. And in a moment, we'll share a couple of demos on how this could potentially look like using Votiro's version of data detection and response. So if we think about problem number one, sophisticated threat actors, how they work, how they think, they want to deploy a version of malware, whether through a file or a fileless version of malware, ransomware, in some form of zero-day attack that lands on your endpoint, moves laterally, moves onto a server, and obviously tries to log keystrokes, gain access to credentials, then moves laterally and exfiltrates data from databases or from file shares. How do we protect against that type of problem? So let's look at these three technologies, what they can do and what they cannot do. Michael, would you like to start with DLP?
Yeah, sure. So, for sophisticated threat actors, DLP has some prevention mechanisms, but they are limited. So first off, it can label your data with sensitivity labels, and if the policies are defined properly, these labels can help prevent the exfiltration of that data through the channels that have been defined in those policies. Again, this prevention requires constant management overhead to make sure these policies are being tuned to match the business needs. But however, when it comes to like unknown malware, 0 days, things like that, DLP has a very limited ability to handle those types of risks.
On the DSPM front, it's a much easier discussion, right? DSPM, by definition, does not block malicious content coming in the form of malware ransomware. Some DSPM vendors have added some managed services in different forms, but DSPM as a whole is more a detection tool for private and sensitive data and does not really include any sophisticated level of malware prevention. Data detection and response, however, is exactly that. Data detection and response is a combination of detecting private and sensitive data, holding it back from being exfiltrated through obfuscation, through masking, and removing any malicious or suspicious content that might automate the process of data exfiltration. If we move on to the next slide, right before we jump into a quick demo, let's talk about insider risk, because this is something I've been hearing a lot about lately, and more organizations are realizing that malware coming in is one huge problem. A much easier vector of attack is an insider, right? You have someone inside who either mistakenly or intentionally, they have access to your SharePoint location. They can download a bunch of files and upload it into their personal Dropbox or into any other given cloud storage, or maybe download it onto a USB drive, right? So how do these technologies protect against this specific risk? Michael?
Yep. Yeah, so for insider risks, DLP actually does a pretty decent job of preventing the sharing of data. However, at the same time, the prevention mechanism that DLP puts in place, it actually creates blockers for the productivity of the end users. They are trying to do their jobs, and DLP will step in their way. It'll create a block. It'll create a slowdown, and that requires other people to get involved to make those processes continue working. Right. So that just creates more management overhead for your IT and security teams. and they have to stop what they're doing to help out the end users that are simply trying to carry on with their roles and do their tasks.
So then if we move on to DSPM, for example, that's a very similar story to DLP in the sense that a DSPM tool gives you the visibility into where data is overexposed. So if there's a file or a database or any form of data which is overexposed in the sense that too many users, too many groups have access rights to that environment, it would actually allow you to, can we go back to the previous slide? We could actually go back to the fact that these tools will give you the visibility into who actually has access. And then you would need to go and manually remediate, or in some cases, automate who has access. But there's no real way to prevent a person that already has access from taking that content and that data and sharing it outside of the realm of where it was stored. So I can download the data from my OneDrive. If I had overprivileged access, I can then share it externally. So it's kind of limited what DSPM can do for that type of risk. Data detection and response in that sense really can do miracles. And that is actually because data detection and response, the philosophy behind that technology is that instead of just finding the problems, it automates the prevention in real time. So for example, if data detection and response will detect that Eric is actively trying to send, Eric as an insider is actively trying to send private content through the browser to his own Dropbox or through my corporate email to a Gmail account outside of the outside of our corporate environment, data detection and response will actually mask the data in real time, mask specifically that private data that we choose by policies to obfuscate, to ensure that even if a file finds its way outside of the organization, the private data is always safe, is always secure. Even if it is then reshared, that data is safe to be used and compliant. And I'd like to jump here into a quick demo. Michael, you can take over, and let's see how this happens in real life.
Yep. So like Eric mentioned, data detection and response is basically constantly monitoring the sharing and the transfer of unstructured data between different users, both inside the organization and outside the organization. And to show you an example of how this works in real time, what I've done is before our presentation here, I sent an email to one of my demo users. This email came in. It includes a document. In this case, it's similar to a phishing email, but this could be a legitimate email. It really doesn't matter because obviously when you're receiving a file coming into the organization, there's always the potential threat in this. Your traditional EDR tools, your antivirus and signature-based tools, if there's known malware in this, it can potentially pick them up. However, there's constantly new malware being created. That information is, it takes antivirus tools 6 weeks, sometimes more, before they actually catch up to to new malwares being created. So in this case, I've actually embedded this file when I send it to my test user with some unknown malware. So this user received the file. Let me jump over to our console so you can actually see what happened with this file. As this file came through the organization, we picked it up, we grabbed it out of the user's mailbox, we scanned the contents of the file, we looked at every single embedded object inside of that file, and scanned every one of them individually to see if they was an unknown object that should not be in that file. These, things like scripts, malicious content, embedded objects, unknown 0 days, our engine is able to pick out and find the positive content and actually create a new file that delivers over only the positive content and leaves behind the unknown objects. So we can see in this file that was sent, this invoice document that I received in my email, there was an embedded zip file inside of that document that contained a LNK file that launches a PowerShell script. Our engine found that file. It was able to block it out via policies, and deliver on to the end user a safe file with all of its active content still available and only the malicious content left behind. At the same time that we sent that document, we found and scanned for sensitive content. In this file, we found things like a phone number, an account number, things like that. And based on our policies, we chose to block out that specific pieces of information. If we go back over to our document and we actually open it up and look at the file, we can see the content that's opening on my other screen. I'll bring it over in just a second. We can see what the end user actually received. They received this document. Again, we found an account number and we blocked that out because this user, through our policies, has been said this user should not be able to see account information or social security numbers or whatever policies you've designed for your end users. You know, it's based on users or groups, things like that. So we blocked out that sensitive content from this file. At the same time, that embedded zip file that's trying to get past your security tools with an unknown malware, we found that file and we blocked it out as well. So this gave a very secure file delivered to your end users without any interaction from IT. It removes sensitive content that you've determined to not be usable by this user, and they're able to continue working, doing their job with a safe file. They get the rest of the content, and there's no malicious data included in this file.
So with that, let's talk briefly about two additional types of risks. We talked about incoming malware threat actors. We talked about insider risk. Third-party risk, that is a big, and very broad topic that we can talk about. But there are multiple different types of things we can look at when we talk about third-party risk. The first one is, how do we ensure that even if our third party has a lower security stance and lower security policies than we do, how do we ensure that we don't get infected by incoming traffic? The second one is, how do we ensure that there's no oversharing of sensitive data or private data, both outbound to the third party, but also inbound? How do we make sure that we don't consume and put our third party at risk? So if we're using contractors, how do we ensure that we do not receive information which we don't have good controls on? So again, looking at this from the lens of these three different technologies, I can start by looking at, for example, DSPM. So DSPM can find some exposed data. However, it would not be able to look into the private data that is stored within that third party, right? Unless there's a very collaborative third party that allows us to put tools in place, but that honestly, in most cases, doesn't make sense whatsoever. So DSPM mainly can be helpful when ingesting private data into our own stores from a third party and then finding it and putting controls on it as an after the fact issue, where DDR, for example, on this case, would be doing something completely different. Data detection and response in this case, because of the nature of the technology, which can look at not only data at rest, but also data in motion, it would actually be looking at the traffic in between your company and the third party, looking at what is allowed to be shared, what type of private and sensitive data is allowed to be shared versus what not, and putting in place controls like masking. Michael, do you want to touch on DLP?
Yep. So obviously, when it comes to third-party risk, the prevention of sharing of sensitive data is a key need. With all the collaboration tools that are now being used, it's very easy to accidentally share information to a third party, and you lose control of your sensitive content. So DLP can help mitigate this, but the organization can really only enforce those policies on the systems that are under their control. And with the rise of collaboration tools and BYOD devices in many organizations, this prevents or creates a major challenge for preventing the loss of that data.
And Michael, I'm seeing a couple of questions on the chat, which I think is a perfectly timed,
Yep.
very related to DLP. So there's a question about how password protected attachments, for example, are dealt with. And also in that same context, so we'll actually get to a second point in a moment, but I want to make an important point here about password protected files, especially because we're talking about DLP. For the person that asked that question, you're spot on, right? The easiest way to circumvent a DLP tool or an endpoint detection tool or an antivirus or a sandbox, any one of those could be tricked by sending in either malicious content or private data through a password protected and encrypted file. Why? Because it's encrypted. Nobody has the passwords to decrypt the file. You cannot look into the content. You cannot inspect it. There's nothing you can do with it. So it flies through and it lands. How does data detection and response differ? So data detection and response as a whole, as a market, doesn't really differ. What is different is Votiro's interpretation of data detection and response. And I'll give you a good example. Because we've been in the file security space for over 12, 13 years, we actually have a mechanism that can allow, when the file is being delivered, it can allow the sender or the recipient to type in the password. Once that password is typed into the file itself and unzipped and obviously then inspected, that file can then be inspected deeply, both for private content and for malicious, suspicious content, cleansed, sanitized, masked, made safe and compliant, repackaged, and delivered still as a password-protected encrypted file to the user. However, at that point in time, it is already safe and compliant. So you're absolutely right that a traditional DLP tool or DSPM tool or endpoint detection tool or sandbox would not be able to tackle that problem. Data detection and response, when implemented correctly, can actually solve that problem as well.
Yeah, and Brian, I can show this in a demo here we have in about 2 slides, exactly how that process works.
So let's move on to the last one, which I believe is compliance. And here, so, when we think about the reasons why we have tools in place, cybersecurity tools in place, for many of us, it's we want to avoid data exfiltration. We want to avoid being breached for reputation reasons and IP protection and many different reasons. But there's also the compliance aspect, things we have to do. Yeah, we don't like it, but we have to do it. So there's a list, a checkbox list where we have to check a few different things, put a few tools in place, and ensure that we can not only say that we have the tools, but ensure that we can prove to an auditor that our controls are documented and effective, and obviously that we, in many cases, that they are automated. So for that, if we talk about the different tools quickly, and then we'll jump into the demo, every one of these tools has a different play within the compliance space, right? Data loss prevention will ensure that data doesn't leave through the mechanisms which data loss prevention can control. So doesn't leave the endpoint, doesn't leave through email. That is usually where that ends. DSPM will come in and will allow you to scan your cloud stores, your data stores, and tell you what's at rest and is it compliant or not. And then what data detection and response basically does is it actually enhances those two, in the sense that with data detection and response, you can do two additional interesting things. The first one is you can start looking at data in motion in real time. So instead of just looking at data at rest and looking at a small subset of data in motion, you can now look at all data in motion across both on-prem and cloud environments, in public cloud, in private cloud, wherever data moves. Data detection and response can allow you to track that from a visibility standpoint. But the second side of that problem is, because data detection and response can also mask the data and mitigate it, that actually means that you will remain in this always compliant posture, which means you don't need to remediate every year with a 2-month exercise you will always be in compliance and remain in compliance, and you can prove it. Let's jump into that last demo, Michael, and I think we're coming up to a close.
Yes. So let me actually add one more file to my my demo here so we can show that password protected piece as well. So keep in mind our platform works across all sorts of sharing tools. It works across the entire Microsoft suite, you know, your email, your OneDrive, your Teams, SharePoint. We're able to do this process in all of those tools. We also have an external API that if you have custom applications and you want to do some of these control mechanisms and sanitization capabilities, you can integrate these with your custom applications as well. So what I have here is I've got a OneDrive folder. It's got a number of files inside of it, including an encrypted archive that you mentioned in your question. I'm going to tell our platform to manually scan this folder. However, this process can happen automatically as files are uploaded and downloaded into those folders. But I'm going to scan that and show you what we're able to do in OneDrive. So I've told this to scan every file in that folder. For compliance reasons, you can point this to SharePoint sites or parts of your organization. We can scan through all of the contents of those files. We can detect that sensitive data inside of that, and we can create and reports and information around that. So I've finished scanning that file. Before I jump over to back to the OneDrive, let me take a look at our privacy and compliance dashboard. Since we're constantly monitoring these files as they flow around your organization, we can tell you which users in your environment are sharing this content, what type of content is being shared, which channels it's being shared through, and then you can drill down into this information to get more data around how these files are being utilized and where they're going in the organization and outside the organization. So I'm gonna jump back over to OneDrive. I scan this folder, and if we go back and look, every one of these files has been scanned. If I look in my event log, we can see we scanned through all of those files. In the instance of that encrypted archive, we can see that our task, or the first thing we do when we're dealing with encrypted files is stop the transfer of it because we don't know if it's safe or if it has content in it that shouldn't be shared. So we block that file. On the end user side, what they receive is a PDF. That PDF gives them more context around what happened with the file, why it's being blocked. This is customizable by the end user or by the company that's using this software. So you can put your own content in this. However, it gives a prompt to say, hey, let's make sure this file is safe before we allow it to be sent across the wire. So it asks for the password. I provide the password to the platform. In the background, it has taken that file, it's unencrypted it, it's scanned all of the content inside of that file down many layers throughout the file to look at anything that's embedded inside anything else. It then reassembled it, it packaged it back up and delivered it on to the end user. So if I go back to the OneDrive platform and I do a refresh, we can see that encrypted archive is now back. The content that's inside that, if we go back over to our dashboard and reset, we can see that file was unencrypted. The contents of it were scanned for the malicious data, the sensitive data, and we found inside of, in this case, we found a docx inside of that actually has an embedded malware inside of it. And we blocked it. We recreated the file. We delivered it onto the end user automatically with no interactions from IT or the security team. And the user got the file safe without the malicious content and was able to continue doing their job in real time. So it's very powerful capabilities. We do it across all of the different collaboration platforms, and we integrate with third-party apps if you have those, including things like browser isolation tools and external, Zscalers and Palo Altos and Menlos, things like that. So it's a very powerful tool. Eric?
Okay, I think let's move on to that last slide and just quickly summarize. I know we're up on time. We've really rushed through this because this could be a much longer discussion, and we're always more than happy, reach out to us on, you can reach us at info@votiro.com, and we can set up sessions to talk about this in much, much more detail. But as a very kind of high level overall summary, the data protection space, when you're trying to protect your crown jewels, your private data, your sensitive data, I think, the first step that you really should be looking at is let's define first, let's identify what are my crown jewels. Is it social security numbers and driver's license numbers? Is it X-ray images and blood sugar levels, or is it credit card information, CVV, and expiration date, right? Once you've identified that, you'd be looking at a risk view of what is the risk that you're most concerned about. Is it incoming malware that would exfiltrate? Is it insiders that might be oversharing? Is it the fact that you're integrated with third parties that might put either your data at risk or just risk your compliance itself? So every one of these angles can help you identify which of the tools would be most efficient. I will say, however, that how data detection and response differs from many of these legacy tools is that it really tackles the modern problem of data in motion in the cloud that frequently moves, frequently explodes across your entire environment, and truly too many users have access to too many locations where that data is stored, which makes it impossible to control. How do you bring that under control? But how do you do it in an automated way, which doesn't require a team of 20 analysts just looking manually and remediating every single day? The answer to that is data detection and response. We'd be more than happy to set up time to talk through this, through a demo, and help you out with any one of these problems. Michael, any last thoughts?
Yeah, so the place where we really help organizations obviously is everybody has large amounts of tools. They have limited manpower, and it's difficult to keep up with the constant changes. With our solution, everything we do is automated. So once it's implemented, you really just let it do its thing, and you don't have to interact with it very often. And it just makes your environment safe from both sensitive data and malware.
Thanks everyone for joining. We will share the webinar, and any questions that we can answer, we'll send you back. We'll reach out back, and other than that, have a fantastic weekend and happy holidays.